Good evening, everyone. My name is Alan Edmonds, and I'm the president of Brandywine Workshop and Archives, which is your host sponsor for this evening. We are very happy to be able to present to you what we consider to be the first special event of our 50th anniversary year. The event is a major exhibition titled All My Ancestors, the Spiritual and Afro-Latinx Art. And we're so fortunate to be able to have as our curator, Tatiana Rianaza, who is an assistant professor at the University of Notre Dame. I met Tatiana about 10 years ago at the University of Texas, where she was finishing up work on her doctoral studies and preparing her dissertation on Latino print workshops in the US. Through her research for her dissertation, she visited Philadelphia and visited the Atelier Puerto Ricano, as well as Brandywine Workshop and Archives. And we've had a very wonderful relationship for the last 10 years, where she serves on our advisory committee for our online database, artour.org. It's a free database of all the artists for the last 50 years that have come through Brandywine and produced prints, artists that have received the Lifetime Achievement Award, and various other activities that we document here at Brandywine. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Tatiana Rianaza from the University of Notre Dame.
Well, bienvenidos a todos. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the virtual opening of All My Ancestors, the Spiritual and Afro-Latinx Art. Before I give you a brief introduction to the exhibition, there are several folks I need to thank. First and foremost, Alan Edmonds for believing in this project and encouraging me to embark on the research. While much of the checklist was drawn from the permanent collection at the Brandywine, we made acquisitions and loans from this larger Latinx print network that includes Seria Project in Austin, the Robert Blackburn Printmaking Workshop in New York City, the Dominican York Proyecto Gráfica, Coronado Print Studio, as well as individual artists. It is no easy task curating a show under pandemic conditions, and I feel like I could have never done any of this without the support of the Brandywine team, which includes Jessica Haman, Grace McLaughlin, Deja Nicole Stokes, Gustavo Garcia, and Matthew Singer. If you haven't had a chance to do so, I'd like to encourage everyone who's tuning in to download a free copy of the catalog, which is available on the website and was produced with funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Dedalus Foundation, and includes a wonderful introduction by Shelley Langdale, who heads up Modern Prints and Drawings at the National Gallery of Art. So as Alan mentioned, about 10 years ago, I found myself in Philadelphia researching the work of Puerto Rican artists, and that led me to meet Alan and learn about this amazing archive of prints that's housed at the Brandywine Workshop. I've since become involved in a number of initiatives there, including joining the advisory board for artura.org. This website is an interactive digital archive that the Brandywine launched in the last couple of years, which has gained momentum during the pandemic as many educators have transitioned to hybrid forms of learning and incorporated digital tools into their curriculum. My students at Notre Dame have been involved in the research process, authoring object descriptions, artist biographies, and bibliographies that can be used by audiences all over the world. We strive to make these archives accessible and to level the playing field in an art world whose collections remain overwhelmingly white and male. In our conversations about Artura, we talked about creating new content, and the idea came up about developing exhibition projects that could showcase the collection and connect to broader conversations that are happening in the field. My idea for All My Ancestors was inspired by the work of some of my colleagues, like Elaine Rodriguez, whose 2019 exhibition, Afrosyncretic, showcased the vibrancy of diasporic Blackness in Latinx culture, as well as Tatiana Flores' article on the anti-Blackness that is at the core of Eurocentric conceptions of Latinidad. When Black Lives Matter protests erupted in the summer of 2020, many of us were perplexed at seeing signs like the one I'm showing on the right. The Black Honduran American writer Janelle Martinez noted in a Washington Post article that it was extremely problematic because it's erasing Blackness. And she wasn't shocked at all because this was on brand for the Latinx community. What Martinez is getting at is that the erasure that Afro-Latinx people experience when 1 in 4 US Latinos identifies as Black, and yet their own community could not recognize them as Latinx. We know that the slave trade brought millions of enslaved Africans to the Americas, and of those who survived the Middle Passage, a great majority lived, worked, and regained their freedom in Latin American and Caribbean nations. But the national policies of these Spanish-speaking countries often encouraged racial mixing to whiten the national makeup and produced internal racism, colorism, and erasures that remain present. I became interested in doing this show because most Latinos are in complete denial of their African ancestry. And I also felt that many African Americans are also unaware of the ties that bind them to the Afro-Latinx diaspora. So I did what I do best, and I spent time looking at the print archives. And I worked with one of our fabulous art history students at Notre Dame, Kendra Limo, and we started to see these connections between the work being produced at Brandywine and the work being produced at these other Latinx workshops around the country. The theme that kept coming up was spirituality. But what I learned is that spirituality in this field is loaded with meaning. It's a huge spectrum. It's a site of creativity and resilience. I started reading the work of scholars like Marta Morena Vega, one of the first to document the spiritual dimension of Afro-Latinx art, and learned about artists whose work drew on ancestor worship, syncretic rituals that combined African religions with Christian iconography, musical breakthroughs that were inspired by the rhythms of Santeria and the Abacuá, artists who sought a spiritual connection with nature and a stewardship of land, and those who used religious iconography to subvert systems of power. I'll briefly show a few of the gems in the exhibition, though I hope many of you will get a chance to see the show in person and/or download the catalog to browse the checklist. The Brandywine has been instrumental in creating connections with Cuban artists at the Taller Experimental de Gráfica in Havana. Many of them have been resident artists, and among them, the work of Belkis Ayllón is a standout. Ayllón began to research the history and mythology of the all-male secret society of the Abacuá when she was still in high school, and the rich iconography of its narratives became her preferred subject matter in her printmaking. Her residency at the Brandywine, which took place the same year of her untimely death, resulted in 2 offset lithographs, one of which I'm showing you here. Juan Sanchez's print, Prayer and Struggle, which graced the cover of the catalog, draws on Sacred Heart imagery and speaks to the struggles of poverty, displacement, and unfreedom that Puerto Ricans experience as a result of their colonial relationship to the US. Through his signature collage style, we see a mother's handwritten prayer, children in the Puerto Rican Day Parade, Ramon Frades' El Pan Nuestro, and an upside-down bald eagle. Jamaican-born artist Keith Morrison is represented with several prints in the exhibition. He is a masterful colorist, and in this series, he points to the African origins of New World music, like the Argentine tango. Similarly, Dominican York artist Moses Ross also explores this connection to music with a dancing figure that bridges the divide between his beloved island and the bustling city of Manhattan. Moses Ross actually came out of the graffiti art movement in New York, went on to study architecture, and does a lot of public art projects around the city. And I love how the title of this work alludes to bachata and reggaeton as these musical genres that have become synonymous with the DR and New York City. Juan Bosa is another fascinating figure of the Cuban exile generation. We loaned this important work from the Blackburn Workshop in New York. Bosa was known as an artist priest, and many of his works reference symbols of the Orishas. Here we see an elegant vessel that doubles as a sacred cauldron containing a spirit. Diogenes Ballester, who hails from Ponce, Puerto Rico, is also represented with a number of prints in the exhibition, including this one, which he produced through a residency in Austin, Texas. Here he created a dreamlike market scene, perhaps something he had recently observed in his many travels, where a trader stands before a basket of chickens. We see cowrie shells swirl around this compressed space, alluding to their symbolism as protective talismans and objects of divination. We also have a number of younger artists in the exhibition, and that's something that's very important to me, but also to folks like Alan who want to encourage young folks to take up the tradition of printmaking. And they are producing powerful works that are rooted in the traditions of African diasporic spirituality. Among them, Ghislaine Rodriguez, who is based in Amsterdam and New York. She provided an etching produced last year that is based on an opera film commissioned by the Americas Society. The work draws on an African legend in which a queen refuses to sacrifice her beautiful bird and is condemned to death for her disobedience. The legend has interesting parallels to the tale of Princess Sikan in the Avaqua imagery of Belkis Ayun. And that's just a very short overview of some of the gems that are in the show. But now it's my great honor to introduce the artist scholar, Dr. Arturo Lindsay, one of the artists in the exhibition. In fact, his Children of Middle Passage series is really the centerpiece of the show. And he's also one of the essayists in the catalog. Dr. Arturo Lindsay is a native of Colón, Panama. At age 12, he migrated with his family to Brooklyn, New York. He is based in Atlanta and Portobello. He's an artist, scholar, and educator who conducts research on African spiritual and aesthetic retentions in the Americas. His mentor, Dr. Janetta Cole, taught him how to view and therefore understand contemporary art of the African diaspora through the lens of an ethnographer. Lindsay has exhibited in over 150 solo and group exhibitions. He authored over 20 essays on the art and aesthetics of the African diaspora and edited the groundbreaking volume, Santeria Aesthetics in Contemporary Latin American Art, recognized as a pioneering text that explores the legacy of the Yoruba aesthetic from antiquity to contemporary art theory and practice. It has become a must-read for contemporary artists, critics, and curators. Dr. Lindsay is Professor Emeritus and former chair of the Department of Art and Art History at Spelman College. He holds a Doctor of Arts degree from NYU and an MFA from UMass Amherst.
Tatiana, muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me begin, before I begin my actual presentation, I want to take a moment. I want to pause for a moment and thank Alan Edmonds, the founder and president of Brandywine, for his vision of inclusion. Alan and I go back for a long time. Professor Tatiana Reynosa of Notre Dame, I also want to thank for including me, in the all my ancestors exhibition, and for selecting, me to be to participate in this presentation today. It is not very often that Afro Latinx are given an opportunity to discuss the nuances of race, national, and ethnic identity in a public forum. So for that, I'm truly thankful to you, Alan and Tatiana, and the Children of Middle Passage. Thank you. I would also like to thank the tech staff, Jessica Harmon and Grace McLaughlin, without whose technical skills, we certainly would not be doing this, here tonight. Let me move to what the talk is going to be about, reflection on Afro-Latinx identity in contemporary art and aesthetics. But before I start with my talk, let me just pour some libations. El igual, abre la puerta que ya comienza. El Eguá, niño divino, guardián de la encrucijada, ábreme la puerta, por favor. El Eguá, tú eres el único que puede tirar una piedra ayer y pegar un pajarito mañana. El Eguá, please open the door. I must call on El Eguá, the Orisha of the crossroads, before I begin any important event. And I think this is a really very, very important presentation. So on that, let's buckle up the seatbelts and let's get started. Okay. The 1955 murder of then 14-year-old Emmett Till scared me. It terrified me. I was a kid in Cologne, and I remember being at the Clubhouse Theater on the Canal Zone. It's one of the few times that we Colonenses could go onto the Canal Zone. And in the theater there, what they would begin was with a cartoon, and then they would show some news, etc., and then get into two features, as a matter of fact. And they gave the news, you know, as just part of the news. They just mentioned that this kid, Emmett Till, you know, was murdered for theoretically, you know, whistling at a white woman. An allegation that proved to be false much later in life. But what I could not figure out is, how did they know that the woman was white and not a light-skinned Negro? I also asked myself, in the United States, if I whistled at a girl that I thought was a light-skinned Negro, but she was white, would they lynch me? I was 9 years old. And these are the things that I am thinking about in relationship to race. So when I go through this talk about identity, you see how, you know, my perspective from a young Panamanian in Cologne, you know, addressing issues that not only is about race, but about nationality and ethnicity, etc. So let's talk about who I am. I'm a proud Afro-Antillano, a Black Antillian. Our ancestors came from different Caribbean islands to build the Panama Canal. Ask any Panamanian about Diggers, Descendants, Calypso Band, and you will hear them sing about how the canal was built by our grandparents, okay? As a child, I was called Negro, Colored, Mestizo, Moreno, Trigueño, Mulatto, and Negro. It was called a bunch of things, and it didn't really matter, you know, because what it was, I was Panamanian, and I am Afro-Antillano. At Don Porfirio Melendez Elementary School, there were many shades of colored girls, ranging from phenotypically white to brown to Indian to Asian to Black. But we all got along and we all played with each other. And as a matter of fact, at 9, 10, 11 years old, we began to flirt with each other. Not having a clear understanding about race in the United States, I decided that I would stay in my hometown of Cologne, and I will never, ever, ever go to the United States. Problem solved, or so I thought. But life happened. And 3 years later, I was on a boat sailing to New York City. In Brooklyn, I found home in the Panamanian diaspora. I was reunited with my family, with tias and tios and primos and primas that I thought I would never see again in life, but also with friends from Panama. As a teenager, I ran into two girls from Cologne that I grew up with, and they lived on the same building. So I was beginning to really feel at home. I also found home in New York City, in the Puerto Rican and the New Yorican communities and the Black American communities. It all felt like home. Like Nicolas Guillen, I recognized myself in the Black bodies, the Black faces, the Black voices, and in the Black music of Black Americans, and I identified with their struggle for civil and human rights. It was my struggle as well. As my brother's keeper, I recognized myself in the Puerto Rican struggle for self-determination. Growing up in Panama, I felt the oppressive yoke of neocolonialism and Jim Crow presence of white supremacy on the Canal Zone. It was easy to identify with the plight of Puerto Ricans wanting to be free. It was my experience as well. I was surprised when I was in high school and a classmate asked me why I cared so much about the Negro problem. I immediately responded by saying, my African ancestors did not have passports or visas. Did yours? The question confused me Our ancestors did not choose to come to America. And by the way, when I say America, I'm talking about the entire continent, okay, North and South, not just the United States. And when I say African American, I'm also talking about people of African descent born in America, anywhere on the continent of America. Anyway, the Africans that were brought, our African ancestors that were brought to America, they were kidnapped and brought to this continent in chains. We all know that. That's history. Which, by the way, is a history that here in this state of Connecticut, of Georgia, folk don't want in elementary children to be, and high school kids to be learning. But that's another story. Anyway, the question confused me. Our ancestors did not choose to come to America. They were kidnapped and brought in chains. And in America, they produced a mestizaje africana, a mixing of African peoples that made us the largest, most diverse, and wealthiest African ethnic group in the world. As a teenager, I became a social change activist, looking for a way to end racism, bigotry, and imperialism. So I participated in demonstrations, marches, boycotts, and rallies. I wouldn't mention anything about the riots, but nevertheless, I felt that something was missing. Eventually, I found a path in Gordon Parks' autobiography, A Choice of Weapons. Gordon Parks helped me to choose art as a weapon to fight all of the isms that were oppressing humankind and essentially oppressing me. I came to realize that art had a much longer lasting and a greater impact on society. So I joined the struggle as a self-taught artist. My art practice began with overtly political statements painted in an expressionist style that was looking at the demonstrations that were happening, in my community. The painting that you see on the right is one of my earliest paintings. It's called The Morning After. I was a very idealistic, young man at the time. And by the way, I still am very idealistic and very, very emotional about stuff. As a college student, I dedicated myself to Black and Brown liberation by working with teenagers living in housing project in New Britain, Connecticut. My focus was on building cultural bridges by emphasizing what we have in common rather than the differences that divide us. In Hartford, Connecticut, I also worked with Black and Brown teenagers, sometimes from rival gangs, painting murals featuring Black and Latinx jazz musicians and political leaders. As my interest in investing my work with things African grew, Botanicas became my art supply stores. A botanica is a store generally found in Latinx communities that sells herbal medicines as well as religious objects, for Yoruba and other African-based, traditions. You'll find these stores in Latinx communities, but take a look at the in the lower left-hand corner, as a matter of fact, at the those objects that you see there, because you'll see those objects appearing, in my work. And this particular installation is called Homenaje a Yemaya. Yemaya was the Yoruba Orisha, of the waters. And you can see where these objects are purchased. One of the reasons I applied to graduate school was to study African art for inspiration for my own work. This 16th century ivory mask from Benin is one of the first African art objects to grab my attention. In grad school, I learned to do bronze casting and soon began making a series of bronze masks. And you will notice in this work, as well as the previous work, what I'm doing is creating work that's in conversation, with the African object. I was not trying to replicate the African objects, but I wanted them to be in conversation, or rather I wanted to be in conversation with the works that really, got my attention. And so therefore this is what you're seeing. When I was finally able to travel to Africa, I began collecting African art that I was including in my installation. Stylistically, my installations borrowed heavily from Santeria and Yoruba altars that rely on African aesthetic of accumulation. Let me pause for a minute and and ask you to take a look at the installation on the lower right-hand side of Bayana. Bayana was one of the most important kings of the Cimarrones. The Cimarrones are the Maroons that ran away, liberated themselves, and turned around, and fought the Spaniards as a way in which to maintain their freedom. Bayano had one of the largest armies that included indigenous people, and runaway Africans. And I would not be surprised if some of the pirates did not join, Bayano, as well. My nephew Rolandito and his wife approached me when they were pregnant, and were asking about names. And the only name I could think about was Bayano. When Bayano was 5, he was with his school, had gone to a place called Mi Pueblito, which is a living history museum of Panama's diverse ethnic group. For some reason, when he was trying to go into one of the spaces, the exhibition spaces that dealt with Black Panamanians, a security guard at the door stopped him, and said, "No, we're just letting in the Black children for right now." Bayano got a little indignant, stepped back and says, "Yo tengo sangre negra, mi papá tiene sangre negra, mi abuelo tiene sangre negra, y yo me llamo Bayano." Basically, what he said is that I have Black blood, my father has Black blood, my grandfather has Black blood, and my name is Bayano. My grandnephew, Bayano, looks just like a white child, okay? Yes, he has Spanish blood and English blood, and he has a host of mixtures, that he honors. What makes me proud of him, his parents and grandparents, and my family, is that a phenotypically white 5-year-old child can stand up and say, "My name is Bayano." That is the pride in which my family has for our African ancestry. The year after Emmett Till was murdered, my younger brother, Luis Antonio Lindsay, died in a drowning accident. Although my family's loss was not the result of a vicious murder, losing Luisito has had a major impact, on my life, a long-lasting impact, not only on my life, but in my art practice. These are 3 of the original drawings that led to the Children of Middle Passage print series that's in the exhibition. I discussed them in detail, in the catalog, so I would urge you to go to the catalog. The drawings that you saw led to the prints. The multidisciplinary nature, of performative nature of Yoruba and Santeria spiritual practices led Opal and me to collaborate with jazz musician Joe Jennis and a host of artists, students, and faculty members at Spelman College to produce a series of performance art rituals. What we're looking at here is the voyage of the Delfina. And let me read what Opal writes about this. Opal is my poet partner. Opal writes, "The voyage of Delfina was created, quote, to speak into the historic moment of Middle Passage, the history of abduction of millions of Africans from West Africa and their distribution into bondage throughout the Americas," end quote. The project takes its name from the slave ship Delfina that sailed in April 1832 from West Africa with a cargo of 159 Africans and docked in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, a few months later with only 109 Africans. Our symbolic voyage of the Delfina invited our participant of performance to name and name the unrecorded survivors and casualties of the passage. By naming these travelers, both those that survived to live enslaved and those that died in the passage, we intended to ritually undo the erasures of history by acknowledging their souls. We felt that we could make their absence present. The performance was staged in a skeletal structure that you're looking at in the slide right now, created by Paul Thomason. The cast consisted of students, artists, and young people from the community, as well as faculty members. 2/3 of the participants were dressed in Black, representing those that survived the journey to Brazil, and the remaining 1/3 were white, symbolizing the souls of the Africans who perished at sea. Each poem read by Opal, after each poem read by Opal, 5 voyagers rose individually and called out a traditional African name and village to call home the souls of the enslaved person they represented. Those dressed in Black resumed their places on the ship. Those in white stepped off the boat and lay spoon-shaped on the floor outside of the boat, referencing the ocean. As you can see, in this particular side, the students on the left and the right-hand side. Children of Middle Passage has taken Opal and me to lecture and perform at US colleges and universities, as well as 7 cities in Germany. This work also won us a Bellagio Fellowship, where Opal wrote more poems, and I designed a new print series. This is Bellagio, Italy, Rockefeller Foundation. This is one of the prints from that series. And last slide. Next slide, okay. I will end with 2 paintings from the Returning Angels series that memorializes Black and brown young men and women that are being murdered by police, as well as Black and brown young men and women that are being murdered by young people that look like them. This body of work looked at children being murdered in the United States, in the favelas of Brazil, as well as child soldiers killing and being killed in the Democratic Republic of Congo. An underlying theme in my work are the Ibejis. That's why you're seeing 2 of them here. I'm a Baba Ibeji, father of twins, and any serious investigation of my work must include my firstborn sons, Urraca and Joaquin. That said, my youngest son, Javier, figures in many other aspects of my work as well. My children appear in my work in many, many different ways. My art practice has relied on African spiritual and aesthetic retentions intended to reflect the beauty and strength we possess as a people. But also, I would like my work to provoke us to examine how much better we can be when we practice being our brothers and sisters keepers. Alafia. Thank you very much.
There we are. Thank you so much, Arturo. That was a beautiful talk. I know I have a lot of questions I'd love to ask you. You were at Spelman College for many years, and I'm curious what it was like for you to be an Afro-Latino who was interested in bringing attention to Afro-Latinx art. What was it like to work at this historically Black college?
Well, for me, it's the diasporas, As I mentioned before, when someone, asked about why do we care so much about the Negro problem? I mean, damn, it's our problem throughout, And so working at Spelman, or working at University of Panama, which I did work. I got a Fulbright fellowship at one point, and I taught there. But I could have worked in Cuba. I would work, anywhere. It didn't matter. The thing that was most important to me, was being able to, with Spelman, was being able to work at that school. What I did do, by the way, anyone that meets me, within, after my name, is they'll know I'm Panameño, because I'm very, very proud to be, un Panameño, and more importantly, un Colonense, a good Colon boy, etc. But I started doing an investigation of the Congos, on the Caribbean coast of the Republic of Panama. And whenever I travel, to do research, because I'm studying the Congos, this is after the Santeria aesthetics book. I was interested in doing a book on Congo aesthetics. And so whenever I came back, and I used to fly down during Carnival, which meant that I had to leave my classes. And so if I was going to leave a class, what I always wanted to do when I came back is at least tell the students what I was doing. So I'll come back and I'll share with them some slides and I'll talk about, what was happening, and my students, kept on asking if they could come. And I thought, I don't know about that. Not on a research tour. I was not going to have, 8 or 10, students, there, because I'm busy trying to do my work. So I had a conversation with my good friend Sandra Leta, and said, well, what can we do, to, open up, these experiences to young people. And that's how we started the Spelman College Summer Art Colony. And I am really glad that we did that, because, people that came through from the United States, my students that came through from the United States benefited greatly. Among them is Amy Sherrill, who, is known today as the woman that painted the portrait of Michelle Obama. There's also Fahamu Peku. I could go down the list, of students that have gone on to do really very successful things after having an experience in Portobello. So it's about getting them out. And I remember, one time, because usually when I'll come and we're coming late at night, in the morning, I'll take them for a walk, through town, and so Kalida Garcia, one of the students that came down, with me, had said to me, and Amy did the same thing in another different way. Now I understand what the African diaspora is. Because they will walk through the village and they're looking at people that look like a cousin, that looks like an uncle, that looks like whatever. But then they also realize, oh my God, they speak a language that I don't speak. And they became more interested in learning how to speak the language. And the Portobeleños, became more interested in learning language. Let me stop there because I could go on forever on Portobello.
No, that's wonderful. I love hearing about your legacy and about bringing these students to Central America. As you know, we were both born in Centro America. We're both Centroamericanos. I'm a native of El Salvador. You were born in Colón on the Atlantic coast of Panama. So what are some of the ways in which race differs in the Central American context? And there's some particularities with Panama, right? That
Yeah.
Panama was a Black province for very many years, right? So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and also the effect of the canal, how that changed everything.
Well, let me get to the notion of race first. Let's understand that issues, history is different in different places. Do you have racism? Of course, I'm not going to anyway tell you that there's no racism in Panama. There is. I'd be silly to say that. However, when we're talking about identity, and which is what this talk was about, was reflections. When I was a kid growing up, which is when you get your identity, as I said before, I knew who I was as an Afro-Antillano. I knew my grandparents, and I knew my grandfather on my mother's side. Her mother had died by then, and I knew my grandparents on my father's side. I knew my family, etc. But the issue of race, was not there. If anything, it was, like I said, the Afro-Antillano. You have the Afro-Antillano, you have Afro-Colonial, and then everybody else. Okay, but the bond that held us together is that we're all Panameños. We were in many ways like a colony, with an invading army that was there. The U.S. military was always there, so you knew you could disagree with them about so much before you got shot. Obviously, they have no problem shooting brown people and Black people, okay? And so what that I think did is created a stronger bond, among Panamanians, And what I found interesting when I went to New York is that, I'm talking to my, US Black American friends that would get pissed off at some Puerto Rican or Black Puerto Rican. And so you talk about being Puerto Rican, no, you're just Black, Well, the issue was that Puerto Rican was identifying with his national identity, came first because that was what was mostly on the chart, that was in danger, And so I think that politics also, because, race is nothing but a political structure, right? And so it depends on what the history is at the time. So anyway, I don't know enough about El Salvador, so you would have to tell me about that.
Well, I think anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity are very much a part of all these discourses in Central America. And there's a lot of work to be done there. I also wanted to ask you how you've navigated this cultural terrain in terms of exhibitions and collections. Have you found, more support on the African American side versus the Latinx side, or how has that worked out?
It's interesting, for lack of a better term. When it comes to Latino community, well, yeah. When it comes to, let me start off with the African American community. Though there have been major, exhibitions, African American, of African American art, surveys, et cetera, with, folk that and even new curators and writers, you know, in some of these exhibitions, but yet, you know, I'm not getting in there. You know, I'm not always, for a long time, it used to bother me. It's like, damn, why is nobody calling me? Why I find out about the show after to come to the opening? You know, why wasn't I not invited? Because, you know, my work, I thought, could hang, you know, with everybody else's that was in there, the subject matter, you know, the skills, etc. And a friend of mine once, you know, curator, you know, a friend of mine once said to me, "Well, Arturo, man, every time you open your mouth, you say you're a Panamanian." You know, I said, "Yeah, yeah, I am." You know, they said, "Well, you know, this is about a black show." You know, I said, "Well, damn, I'm black too." You know what? You know, you're talking about racial identity, yeah. And take a look at the work. You know, the work addresses, you know, issue of, you know, Afro descendant, you know, folk. You know, take a look at my scholarship. Take a look at my work as an educator. What do I do? Where do I work? You know, and they say, "Yeah, well, you know." That's what I would get on one side. And not to say that's everybody, because there are a number of shows that I've been invited to, you know, that did not exclude me, you know, for being a Latinx or Afro Latinx. Okay. In the Latino community, Latinx community, it's another thing. I'm not part of the big three. You know, yo no soy cubano, no soy puertorriqueño, y no soy mexicano. You know, or four, I would say, to, you know, to include, you know, the DR, right? And by the time you do a show, you know, and you try to cover all those places, there is no room, you know, for the Panameño, you know. And here's the funny thing also, even in Panama, when, you know, shows are being done, and I talked to curators there, I said, "Why didn't you guys call me?" So we have so many opportunities up in the United States, you know. And so it's, you know, maybe this is just an artist complaining, you know, but, you know, my issue is that tell me that my work stinks, you know, or that the content of the work, you know, is stupid. It doesn't make sense or whatever, you know. Tell me that's the reason, you know, but don't tell me that you're going to exclude me because I'm a Panamanian. Chuleta, man, you know, but I'm not giving up being a Panameño.
Well, hopefully that's going to change, Arturo.
Hope so.
At some point, you began to take on the role as an artist scholar, and you started to research the work of other artists who were interested
Yeah.
in Santeria. What sparked this scholarly pursuit, and how did it culminate in this groundbreaking anthology that you published?
Thanks. That's a good question. Um, when I did when I worked on doing the research for my doctoral degree, I was looking at, actually, my thesis is called Performance Art Ritual as Postmodern Thought and Aesthetic Investigation. You know, typical doctoral title, you know, it's like a paragraph, right? You know, and so what I was looking at that time, of course, really very interested in theory, you know, method, you know, et cetera, you know, developing a good research mode, you know, et cetera. But I was looking at performance art, and I was beginning performance art, you know, as coming out of conceptual art, you know, of the 70s, you know, was something that made a lot of sense, you know, to me. And I was right down there in the Lower East Side, you know, and I was hanging out with, you know, folk at the New Rican Poet Cafe. Miguel Algarin was one of my, you know, best buddies, you know, down there, a poet. You know, there was Sandro Redini, Italian guy that, you know, was coming down. He was in the Lower East Side. And we used to do all these, you know, really interesting performance, at least we thought they were interesting, you know, performance art pieces. And so I thought, you know what, I might as well start studying some of this and writing it down, et cetera. So I started doing that. And in the process of doing it, you know, my focus, you know, began to be more on the issue of spirituality, you know, and of course, African spirituality, you know, and so the Yoruba, you know, the Santeria, you know, things, you know, came in. So like you take Ana Mendieta, you know, who at the time, you know, her work was really being recognized by feminist scholars, you know, for feminist reasons, etc. But Ana was also really very clear, you know, that much of the work that she was doing was based on, you know, African traditions in Cuba, you know. So, you know, just a series of, you know, of artists like that, and began to look at their work, at the performance as well as the installations. Juan Bosa was a big one for me as well, you know, because I loved his, you know, huge, you know, installations. And those of you that have a chance to look in the catalog, you'll see a slide of one of my installations that was at the High Museum when I went shortly after I arrived in Atlanta, you know, and they're, you know, pretty big, and they got a whole lot of bush, you know, in it, you know, et cetera. So it just, the interest just kept going, you know. At that time also, I was a Yawo. I was becoming an initiate, you know, of, no, I was becoming, I was an initiate, you know, of Santeria, the Yoruba, you know, tradition. Unfortunately though, I was living in DC at that time, and my madrina, you know, who was, if you are an Iyao, you know, you're learning, you're a child, you know, learning the religion. You really need to have a good guide, you know. And so, you know, Dr. Aleda Portuondo, who taught at Howard University, was my madrina. But then life happened, and I needed to get back to the Northeast, you know, and so I pretty much dropped everything, you know. Didn't drop the, you know, my interest in Santeria, but what I did do is I have a very lengthy conversation with Madrina, you know, and told her I had to get back to the Northeast, but I couldn't see how, you know. And bottom line is, I needed to get back to the Northeast because I was missing my children. You know, that's just the bottom line. You know, what can I tell you? I could give you another big, you know, interest in that. No, man, it was my kids.
So, so there was a lot of things that led up to this interest, the scholarly interest. Part of it was scholarly, but also life experiences that you were happening, right? That you were having, and spiritual experiences as well.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very cognizant of the time, and I just have one last question before we open it up to the audience. I think we'd like to take a couple of questions from the audience, and I see several of them have been writing in the chat. But Arturo, they say that prophecy is hazardous, but where do you see the future of Afro-Latinx art headed? What can we do to bring more visibility to the work of these artists?
I think we just keep working, you know. You know, I wish my students used to come in to see me for advice. I used to have these styrofoam balls, you know, and I'll put that on the table, you know, and I used to have a handkerchief over it. I said, let me look at the crystal ball and see what it said. Because they're asking me, you know, the questions about the future, you know, and I would take it off and I'll put my hand in and I'll get, you know, and I'll do my performance piece, right? Maybe I'll perform in the office. Bottom line is that the only thing I know is work, you know. I come from a working class people. I remember when my kids were young and I mentioned that I was working class, they would go, Papi, we're middle class. I said, how could you all be middle class when, you know, I'm working class, you know? But anyway, my father was a hardworking man, so was my mother, you know, and so is my family. You know, these are hardworking people, and that's who I am. I'm just a worker, you know. And so I do know that, you know, when things, you know, but I'm also a thinker, you know. And so come back for a second, you know, the fact that, see, Panama was invaded by the United States, you know, in 1987, 88, whatever, 89, I think is actually the actual year. I needed to go back home. I needed to figure out what I could do to help, you know, my people. One of the things that I realized is that, you know, there were a number of friends, and some of them, you know, with, you know, PhDs and, you know, DDEs and et cetera after their name. And they would ask me, Arturo, you know, feel really sorry about the invasion, blah, blah, blah. Are there any Black people in Panama? And I go, chuleta. See me beside me and my family. We're not the only one, you know. And, but I realized that there wasn't a lot of folk did not know enough about Panama. So I wanted to create cultural bridges. Just like I mentioned at the talk, I did that with, you know, young gang members, you know, painting murals and all that kind of stuff. No, So I wanted to bring, some young people from the United States to Panama, to Portobelo, to experience the African diaspora, to live it.
Yeah.
It's one thing to read about and all that kind of stuff, but to live it,
That might be a beautiful sentiment in which to close and to invite more people to travel there and to see these places and to do the research, because there are so many artists to discover there. So thank you so much, Arturo. I need to
thank
hand
you.
it off to Alan. I see he's
Yeah,
waiting.
Alan showed up, right?
What a great presentation.
Thank you.
Great, I mean, because everybody's talking about how life experiences their art professionally and spiritually. And certainly art gives us that tool and that lens to be able to consider all the complexities of life. Ideas about race, culture, and ethnicity are very complex, but I like what you said, Arturo, about most people identify first through nationality, the place where they grew up, the place that, stayed with them and affected them. So also again, that the catalog, All My Ancestors, 64-page catalog is available for download. However, if you work at a library, could be a public library, a private library with a Heritage Center or university library, and you want a printed copy sent to your collection to make it available for students, the Dedolis Foundation in New York has funded us to be able to print and mail some printed copies to a number of libraries around the country. So I want to thank all our viewers, and we asked you to register so that we could get you on our mailing list, and we will send you updates on events for the 50th anniversary, as well as our newsletter, which gives real solid content in terms of what we're doing. So again, thank you all, and especially Tatiana and Arturo for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I learned a lot. Thank you.
Maestro.
Okay.
All the best.
Thank you, Alan.
Okay.